Welcome to the fastest daf in town. Today we're Masechtas Menachot daf Mem Tes. We are going to begin on the top of Mem Tes Amud Aleph, the top line. Tani Rabba Bar Chana Kameda Rav. So he learned the following statement in front of Rav. Kivsi at Sarah. So we're continuing to learn about the dinim of Shvuas and the kvasim, that the Shnei kvasim were brought. Now, there's a distinction between a keves and an ayil. Keves is a lamb, or it's called a sheep, which is under a year old. And then afterwards, it takes upon itself the din like an ayil, a ram. So it has to be, as it's in the name, kifsi atzeres, has to be kfasim. It's supposed to be under a year old. Now, let's say this guy was koyin sheshachtan l'shem elim. He shechted it with the intention for it to be an ayil, says Rashi. Now, even though the truth is it was a keves and kvasim, so it was a keves, which is what is supposed to be brought. So he actually did bring the right type of an animal, but he had the machshava that it should be l'shem ayil. So ksher, in this case, we say it's kosher. However, it doesn't work, because you have to bring the tzibur would have to end up bringing a new one. Now, that's the din. Omrule Rav Olu v'Olu. It goes up and it goes up. In other words, it not only is it kosher, but also it's Olu Bal Mashem Chayva. So which means the tzibur doesn't have to bring a new kivsi atzeres. Rav Chisda Mistaber Milsa Rav. When Rav says this din that is totally fine is b'kasaver elim. So he thought it was an ayil that he was sacrificing. V'shachnu shum kvasim, but he shechted it for the sake of a keves. Now he actually wanted to do something wrong, right? He actually thought these were older animals. And he said, I don't care. I'm shechting it like it's kvasim. The reality is it was kvasim. So he was mistaken, but he really ended up doing the right thing by bringing kvasim. Shari kvasim l'shum kvasim nishchatu. The reality is he ended up bringing them. So even though he thought that these animals were elim, and then he shechted it for kvasim, even though he thought that he was doing the wrong thing, the reality is that he lemaisa brought kvasim, so therefore that's why he'll say it would work. However, Abul Ksaver Elim, let's say he thought they were Elim, V'shachlu Shum Elim, and Imam shechted it for that reason, even though they were Kvasim, low. At this point, even though it's true, he thought that it was an ayil, but since he shechted it also L'shum ayil, in other words, he thought, again, that it's an ayil, and not that he thought it was a keves, that it was an ayil. He goes, I don't care, I'm going to shecht it l'shem keves, right? Here he's like, no, it's an ayil, I'm going to shecht it l'shem ayil. That will not work. Low, because akira b'tais havi akira. The fact is, in this case, so Rashi says, going high, di havi yada de kvasim ninhu. This guy thought that it was an ayil. If he actually would have thought it was a keves, so havi shachaluhu l'shem kvasim, then he would have shechted it l'shem kvasim. So, but that's not what happened. Instead, he had a total different machshava based on him thinking that it was actually an ayil. So that's what's called nakira b'tais. And according to this opinion, that's a nakira enough. In other words, it's enough that it's not going to be l'shem chayva. V'rabba omer kira b'tais lo havi kira. Actually, it's not true. He holds that even in this situation, it's not considered to be an akira, so therefore it doesn't make any difference. Even though his machshava was for elim, and he shechted it l'shem elim, we would also say that it would work, because even though it was an akira b'tais, it doesn't count. Omer Rava u'maisvina nashmaisen, and then we ask the kasha on this statement. HaKohanim shepilgu b'mikdash. Let's say you have a Kohen who's given the great responsibility of bringing karbanos, and he has a machshavas pigel, an improper machshava. which will invalidate the carbon from being done properly. So we say that if he was pilgul b'mikdash mazidin chayavin. So if it was done b'mezid, so he has to pay the owner the value of the carbon because he deliberately had a machshavas pigul to ruin the situation. Hashaygin paturin. However, let's say he didn't have any, it wasn't b'mezid that he had a pigul machshava. We'll see what that is in a second. But it was b'shaygig. So in that situation, he does not have an obligation to have to pay the owner. But taniwa pigul and pigul. But nonetheless, it's still considered to be pigul, even though it was done b'shogeg. And certainly if it was b'mezid, it's still considered to be pigul, to cause problems for the carbon. Now, heichidam, what exactly is this person's machshava? What was this kohen thinking? Let's say he knew that it was a carbon chatas, which he only granted a day to eat it. But his machshava was for shlomim, so haishagigin mezidin havi. This is a case of mezid, that he knew it was a chatas, but he had a machshava l'shem shlomim. That's not b'shogeg. He obviously knew in his mind that it was one thing, and he deliberately had a different machshava. So how could you possibly consider that be a case of shogeg? Elav, what's the case? Tiksavar shlomimhu. He thought this animal was actually a shlomim to be eaten for 2 days. The kamachashibol l'shem shlomim, right? Which is a similar case to ours, that if you thought it was an aisle, and you shechted it l'shem aisle. So here, v'katani pigul and pigul, we say your machshava causes it to become problematic. Alma akir b'tois have akira. We see that your machshava, which is an akir b'tos, is an akira. Just like we said above, that if you had the machshava, even though it's a keves, it's kvasim, but you thought it was an aisle, and your machshava was done as an aisle, so that's not going to be good because that was an akira b'tois. You made this mistake on purpose by causing this akira. So apparently we see from here a raya, according to the shita, that akira b'tais is an akira. So really, he knew it was a chatas, and his mechshava was for a shlomim. Well, we said in that case, wouldn't it be a case of b'mezid? So how could you say a case of b'shoigig? It says v'oimer mutter. It says Rashi l'shana is tahainu shoigin. His mistake being a b'shoigig is he thought it doesn't make a big deal. He didn't think it was a big deal if you change from a shlomim to a chatas, and therefore that is how it's possible it could be b'shoigig. Let's look at question TA 28. Kohanim shepigul b'mikdash b'shogeg im havi pigul. So we said like this: if you thought that it was a chatas, right? Kasavar shahachatasi shlomim. So then that's a machlokus in the Gemara. It's totally on whether we say an akira b'tois is an akira. But oimer mutter koyama havi pigul. If it was an oimer mutter, so that everyone holds it would be pigul again. But if he thought it was a chatas, if he thought that a chatos was a shlomim, so that's the machlokus. Just like if it was a kvasim and he thought it was an aisle, so it's also in that case the machlokus whether we see akira b'tais is havi akira. Okay. All right. So fine. The oimer mutter is divrei hakoil. Right. Everyone holds like that. Okay. Masiv Rav Zera. So now Rav Zera asks a question. Rav Shimon Oimer that kol menachos shenikmatzu shlosh shman ksheris. So we had this a while back, a couple months ago, in the beginning of this Masechta. When it comes to a mincha, where you did the kamitza of the flour offering, and you did it shaloy l'shman, we say it's ksheris. In fact, ve'olu bal mishum chayva. Even though we said before that it's not oil l'shem chayva, if it's a chatas, for example, but over here, the shita of Rav Shimon says no. When it comes to a mincha, we make a difference. Why is that? She'ein ha'menachos daimus l'zvachim. You can't compare mincha, a carbon mincha, to a carbon. Why? Shekaimitz machvas or shemar cheshes. Let's say you do a kamitza, and it's b'machvas. It's in a pan, which is a deep frying pan, a deep pan, and your machshava is its l'shum archashas. It was again b'machvas. It's a deep pan, and al marchashes is like a thin pan. So there's two totally different types of pans. So in that case, masa moichichen aleha she machvas. It's clear that it's a machvas. We don't care what you're saying because it's basically you're just saying something which is obviously false. Because if you're saying, oh, this is a machvas, but everyone could see that it's a marcheshes, so we don't really care what you say. So your improper shalol lishma words don't mean anything because your actions speak louder than words. Therefore, it will be oil l'shem chayva. And for that matter, charvel l'shem belula. Let's say you have a mincha which is dry, which means there's no oil, right? There's no vine in it, and you say it's l'shem belula. So again, masim mechichin leheshi charva. Everyone could see with their own eyes that there's no flour, there's nothing, it's a different type of flour because there's no oil and other things added to it. So that's why when it comes to a mincha, it's going to be ol shem chayva. Now when it comes to a carbon, because shchita achas kulon, kabbalah achas kulon, zrika achas kulon, they're all the same. So you could check the carbon, and you don't know the difference between one carbon and the next. Okay, we're over there discussed. Well, some carbonos are different ages, and a carbon could be a zachar. It has to be an oil is a zachar, and a chat is a nekeva. Okay. So hechidami ilem diyada the machvasi. Let's say you knew it was a machvas. The kametz le'lushum archeshes, which is like the case above. So in that situation, we say it works. So kimas moichichin, the fact that you can just see what it really is, my hava. Ha mi'aker ka'akerla, right? You're completely uprooting that which that which it is. Ella, therefore, we say lav the kasavar marcheshasi. We thought it was a marcheshes. The kakamitz lo l'shum marcheshes, which is the same thing. The ta, you made a mistake, even though it really wasn't a marcheshes. It was really a machvas, but you thought it was a marcheshes, and you had the intention for dimir marcheshes, which is the same two things we said before, that it was really kvasim, but you thought it was an aisle, and you shechted it, and you did it l'shem aisle. So too above, by the Kohen, right? We said the same thing, that it was a shlomim, right? And he thought it was a shlomim, and he was machashel l'shem shlomim. So it's all the same thing. So the hacha the only reason why we say it works over here is by mincha, because it's obvious which one is a marcheshes and what's a machvas. They're two totally separate things. You can see it. Haba alma, normally a kir batais have a kira. Yataku, you would say a kir batais is an akira. So Amrulei Abaye, so he'll say the same answer. He knew it was a machvas. The comments le'lushum marcheshes. In other words, he deliberately wanted to have a different machshava than what he actually thought it was. He said, so what's the difference? The fact that everyone can see. When it comes to machshava, which is not recognizable, pasal rachmana. The machshava de minkra, something which is obvious, and he's obviously lying over here. So it's actually shumat kazev, lo pasal rachmana. The Torah will not pasal. The Torah will only pasal with something which is unclear, but something which is clear night and day, the difference. So then it will not pasal. Let's see the next Mishnah. So the Mishnah says hatimidin in ma'akvin as a musafin, v'lo musafin ma'akvin as hatimidin, like we've seen before. So the fact that you have one type of carbon, you don't bring the other one, it's okay. If you don't have the chance to bring a talmid and a musaf, so bring one and not the other, and that's still fine. V'lo musafin ma'akvin zeh. And if you have multiple carboni musaf, they're not mocking each other. Just bring as many as you can. Lo hakribu kevis baboikir yaakov ben arboim. Now we know the carbon talmid. as we say in Parshas Pinchas, this is Rosh Chodesh Landing, we say it's a keves echad tasa b'boiker, it's a keves hasheni tasa b'raboyim. So what happens if you don't bring the keves in the morning? So you can bring the tamid in the afternoon. So Rav Shimon Imosai is man shahayu ointin and shaygin. That's if it was like a mistake or it was an accident. Let's say on purpose, you say, I don't want to bring the tamid shel shachar today. Then lo yakrivu ben arbayim. Then in that situation, you lose the opportunity to bring the afternoon as well. Lo vektir ketairis b'boiker. Now the ketairis, the incense spices, were also, we put them on the mizbeach twice, once in the morning and afternoon. Let's say you weren't makter the ketairis in the morning, so you have to ben arbayim. So again, Rav Shimon, v'kul haisa kriva bein harbayim. So now he says something else interesting. He says that now it's supposed to be a mana. We say pras b'shachas, pras ben arbayim. We split it in half. And if you didn't do the morning ones, then you should bring the entire mana in ben arbayim in the afternoon. We're not mechanech, you can't use the mizbeach hazahav until the kataris were completely brought, which means the entire mana must have been brought. So if you didn't bring the morning, so you have to bring the entirety of it in the afternoon, and once you do that, then the mizbeach hazav can be used. V'lo mizbeach oila el b'tamid shel shachar. The other mizbeach is basically activated, if you will, once the tamid shel shachar is brought. V'lo shulchan el b'lechem upon b'shabbos, and also the shulchan is takes upon itself like it being inaugurated, so to speak, only once the lechem upanim are put on it on Shabbos. So to the menorah takes upon itself its entity and identity once the candelabra is lit. Says the Gemara. So Bamini Reb Chia bar Avin Mirav Chista Tzibur Shein Lehen Tamidim Musafin. So let's say you have a tzibur, but there's just not a lot of animals, unfortunately. So the question is, if you can bring a carbon tamid, or you can bring a carbon musaf. So the question is, what should you do? So ilema tamidin diyaime umusafin diyaime. Let's say it's a carbon musaf which is supposed to be brought today, and the carbon tamid that's supposed to be brought today. So pshita tamidin adifi. Why should the tamid which is brought on that day, is it better? The havilu tadir. Obviously, a tamid is more often than a carbon musaf. But it's also Mekudesh, says Rashi. Tadir b'chol yoim. And Mekudesh, why is it holy? Shahayoim yoim taivu, because today's Yom Tov. Dilav Yom Tov, because if it wasn't Yom Tov, like a musaf, there would be no musaf. Musafin lo havi el Mekudesh. Lashon achar tamidim mekudashim kaidim musafin. The tamidim karvi bereisha. Okay. So anyway, that's the answer. That's the din. Look at question 12. Sibur shein mamoin liknos el tamid or musaf diyoime, on that day my adif umadua. So as we said, the tamid is adif because it's not only tadir but it's also mekudesh. Okay, so that's pshita, and that is question 12. Okay, so Ella, what's the kasha then? Tamidin de lo machar. The tamid is going to be brought tomorrow, umusafin da'idna, and the carbon musaf is going to be brought today. Let's look at Rashi. Kagain, d'yesh lehem b'Shabbos shnei kvasim. You already have 2 kvasim on Shabbos. Levad hatamidin, other than including even not including the tamidim. V'kemaboyle im yakrivam hayoim umusafin. Can you take those 2 karbanos, which is really designated for the tamid? Can you now bring them as musaf karbanos? V'loyihu loy tamid l'machar, and now you're not going to be able to bring the carbon tamid tomorrow. Yanichem l'tzarech tamid machar. So basically, you already brought the tamid, you already brought the shnei tamidim, but you have extra karbanoi, other tamidim, because we have extra karbanos designated for the carbon tamid, as we'll see, for a few days, for 4 days. So there's extra animals for that purpose. Can you basically take them and bring those as the musaf instead, or is it better for you just to keep them designated for the tamid, and you'll bring that for the tamid tomorrow? Tamidim l'machar musafin idna. Tamidin the difi shekain tader because it's more common. O dilma musafin difi havilu mekudesh. It's mekudesh because the musaf, if you bring those karbanos, you're sanctifying the Beis Hamikdash with those karbanos for the musaf. But otherwise, they're just going to sit there and do nothing today. You have to wait until the next day. Armulei tenisua. Hatamidim in ma'akvanes musafin v'lo musafin ma'akvanes hatamidin. So we can understand the machlok, the answer to this kasha based on our Mishnah. V'lo musafin ma'akvan zed. So they're not ma'akiv each other. Nahechidami. What's talking about? Let's say you have tons of karbanos, and ulakadam, and the question just is, which carbon comes first? Should you bring the musaf first, or should you bring the tamid first? We already know the answer to that. We already know the din that when it comes to what comes first, we always bring the tamid shel shachar. It's basically the first thing that is brought in the morning. So to say, we have these two karbanos in front of us, and the question is, which one are we supposed to do first? We all know you're supposed to bring the tamid shel shachar first. So that can't be what we're talking about over here, and that can't be the question. Elapshita deleisle. It must be, as we said, you just don't have enough animals going around. Navi de Yomi. Now, if we're talking about you need to bring the carbon tamid today, you haven't done it yet. Amai tader mekudesh tader umekudesh tader adif. So in this situation, again, you would certainly bring the tamid. Okay, elalav dolamachar. We're talking that you already have the tamid brought, and now you have these animals designated to be brought for tomorrow. And the question is, should you take those karbanos and use them today for the musaf? V'katani in ma'akman zedzeh, and it still says in our Mishnah that they're not ma'akiv one another. Alma ki adadininhu. It must be that they're equal, right? So this kind of addresses this question. Says Rashi, pshita deleisle, ella olu tamidim o musafin. You have to choose musaf or the tamid, and we kind of left it in limbo. We don't know. So it must be that actually they're kihadadininhu. They're actually similar. So therefore, when we ask the question, which one comes first, the tamid for tomorrow or the musaf for today? So in that situation, maybe the answer is they're equal. So Amalei Abai Oilam the Islahu. Really, you have a bunch of karbanos. So if that's the question, the whole question is ulakaidim, and the whole purpose over here is just to ascertain what you do first. You bring the musaf first, or you bring the tamid first. So what do you mean? That wasn't the question, because with the kakashlach shalei hey davar kaidim, we already know that din you're supposed to bring the tamid first. The answer is mitzvah bi almahu. So maybe all they're doing is saying that it's true. When it comes to you have a bunch of karbanos, it's just asking pashit which carbon comes first, the tamid or the musaf, when you have a bunch of these animals. And even though it says, well, there's a pasuk, so that's mitzvah ba'alma. Fine. Let's look at question TB1. Hatamidin ein ma'akvanes musafin. Hech eshel hakru musafin below tamidin. How can you bring a musaf without tamid? Im ein lo hari tadir kaidim. If they're right, so if you have to bring the carbon tamid first. V'im yesh lo hari ha'oila oil rishayna. So we said really in the maskana yesh lo, and it's telling you that the din that the tamid is kaidim is rak lemitzvah ba'alma. Let's say it that way, mitzvah ba'alma. But in the Havamina, we said that really, you're right, it must be a case of delay slay, right? That there's not enough, right? It's or the musaf carbon or the tamid, not both, right? So what do we see from here? That they are equal, okay? So that is another interpretation. I wrote, Kfar Mechanech Hasem Mizbeach. Okay, I don't know what that means. Rak Batamid Shel Ben Harbayim Myri. Let's see what that says. That V'ulai Zet Tali B'Musaf Hayom V'Tabad L'Machar. There we go. Zetoloi Musaf Hayoim v'Talmud Amacher Mi Koidim. Right? There you go. I finally got to the right part of the right answer. I was fishing around. Sometimes you don't know the right answer, you just write a whole bunch of stuff and something hopefully sticks. So I finally got to that. But that's the two pieces. Okay. All right, let's keep on moving. Mitzvah B'Yalmahu. So Tashma. Ein poichsin mishisha taloyim hamuvukarin b'lishkas hataloyim. So the lishkas hataloyim, they kept all these animals, and there was never less than 6 of them that have already been properly inspected to make sure that there's no blemish on them. And as the Gemara continues, Kedei l'shabbos u'shnei yamim tovim shel Rosh Hashanah. So what does that mean? It says Rashi, Shalomum shetzarich levadkar shelo yehei behen mum arba yamim koydem l'shchita. We actually have to have 4 days before the shchita to have it examined. L'hachi srichin shisha. So why 6? Shemi iru shnei yamim tovim shel Rosh Hashanah. Let's say it's a 2-day of Rosh Hashanah, right? B'chamishi b'Shabbos, on a Thursday, and then a Friday, and then a Shabbos. V'yitzrichuhu b'chol yoyim shnayim. Every day you have to bring 2. So you have to have 2 on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, on Thursday, 2 on Saturday, and 2 on Sunday. So therefore you have to have all of these for that type of a scenario. Says Rashi, Im iru b'yachad shehi kedei la'akrav shnei tamidim le'yom. Okay, now, hey chidami, what exactly are we saying? Ilema de islay tamidim u'musafin. So let's say you have a bunch of carbon, you have a bunch of animals, and tamidim, of course, you have to have 2 a day, but the musafin on Rosh Hashanah was certainly a lot more than just 2. So 2 of a havi. I understand, why do we say you should have 6? L'chari, you should have a lot more than that, as Rashi says. What is many? The esrim v'tarti taloyim b'inan. You'll need 22. The tavi shisha l'tamidin, v'sheish esu musafin. So you'll need 6 for the tamidim, 2 for each day, 2, 2, 2, and then an additional 16 corresponding to Shabbos and the 2 days of Yom Tov. So obviously it can't be talking about you have all these animals. El vav delesle, you just don't have a lot. And what do we see? Shema minat tamidim adifi, right? That even though, right, it's better, right, better to keep these tamidim, in which will be brought at a later date, at a later time, than to take a behemoth, to take an animal for a musaf. So apparently this is a raya, okay? Because others, why do you have to keep 6? It must be because we would need to have them for the tamidim, and even if you don't have for the musaf, so that's more important. So lo, le'oyilim de'isle, really have a whole bunch of animals. So if that's true, so then why only for the tamidim and not for the musafin? The v'hachi kaimer, ein ba'ixle mishisha taloyim hamuvakar b'lishkas hataloyim dalad yomim kaidem shchita Umani ben Bagbagi. The sign ben Bagbag Omer Menain Latamid Shitayin Beaker Dalad Yomim Kodesh Shlita. This is not because we're not going to be able to necessarily need to use more karbanos, of course, for the musaf, but a carbon musaf does not need this 4-day Beaker din. Why not? Because it's Exeris Akasav. That it's daf when it comes to the carbon tamid and something else, as we see. Talmud Omer Tishmeru lahakriv liba mu'adoi, which of course is taken from the Rosh Chodesh laning, which is the Tamid carbon. It should be safeguarding until 14th day, and which is referring to the carbon Pesach. So malholon tain biker arba yomim kodem shchita, avkan tain biker arba yomim kodem shchita. So it doesn't really get into the nitty-gritty as to the significance of why it has to be that way, but nonetheless, that is a definitely, you can just push it, say it's an exeris akasav, that we require, it has to be 4 days in advance, which is question 13. Be'elu karbanos me'inan biker arba yomim koidem shchita, so the tamid, and also Carbon Pesach. But when it comes to the Musaf, not. That's the only reason why we have to have these sticking around, is because we need them specifically for that purpose. Okay. All right. Let's look at we did TB1. Do we do question TA1? Kohanim Shepigu B'Mikdash. We did that already. Okay, so let's finish up this stuff. I think that's it for questions. So Talmud Loimer Tishmer. So we saw the connection between the Carbon Pesach that we require Bikor Arba Yomim for Shchita. So to Afkan Toin Bikor Arba Yomim Kanim Shchita. Armule Ravino Ravashi. So Hani Shisha. Why are we saying there's 6? Shiva Havi. We really shouldn't. 6 shouldn't be sufficient. L'chayra, you should have to have a 7th one. Why? Ta'ika de safra, because how about in the morning? Says Rashi, the safra de tlasa b'shabbatah. Says Rashi, the bishlom of the bein arbayim, when it comes to the afternoon, udiyim sheni v'shlishi, on Tuesday and Wednesday, ikla meimer shiyachser b'yom rishon, achar taloyim muvukarim arbiyomim kaidim. Ela b'moitzi Shabbos, on Saturday night, lo yachol lachsor, right? Uma yakrib l'boiker, b'had denaka chad b'Shabbos, hainu ki havi Rosh Hashanah chamishi v'shishi, right? Because there's a Thursday, Friday Yom Tov. V'hodinami havi Rosh Hashanah Barishon v'sheni. Also, Rosh Hashanah is on Monday and Tuesday. Matzi l'mifrach. You could have said the same question. V'ika safra d'shlishi b'Shabbos. That's a problem on the Tuesday morning. So basically, that's what it's saying, is that you would need the Talmud for the following day as well. Okay, and it says over here that's actually what the girsa is, which is what I read in the Gemara. But you'll see on the side it really says the chad b'Shabbatah, which is on Sunday morning, right? Because how else are you going to have this animal, right? You need another one. So tami havi, you should have 8. Deha'ikap depanya demali Shabbatah. Maybe you should say you need another one for the afternoon on Erev Shabbos. Says Rashi, the kaidim shehikriv tamid, that we thought that before you were marked the tamid shel ben harbayim shel Erev Shabbos kaimer. We're talking about on Friday, the lahavi shisha. Okay, so halu kasha. The labasar the akriv kaimer. We're talking about after you're already makriv it. After you're makriv the afternoon one, you still have to have this many left. So mikol makom shiva habi, you need for the next morning afterwards. Elatana ba'almakoi. So it says Rashi, Simana ba'almanakat. Koimer, Haidu nakat shisha lav l'shabbos u'beis yomim davka koimer. Elafil koyimoy sachoil. Boy, it doesn't make any difference. Like, it's not like you only need 6 for this one scenario. No, there's just a halacha that you always need to have 6 of these talmidim available 4 days in advance. It doesn't make any difference, even though maybe sometimes you may need 7 based on this logic. No, it's just a simma. That's just what it is. Umay kidei l'shabbos ubeis yom and tel Rosh Hashanah simon be'alma. That's just like a simon that there's 3 days, so it's 2 each. Deganami the tani kidei l'shabbos v'okatani l'shabbos l'beis yom and tel Rosh Hashanah shma mina. Okay. So again, it's just that's how much is brought. But again, all we're saying here is we don't necessarily have a raya that if you have not enough karbanos, that you should maybe take the tamidim, which are going to be used for tomorrow, and instead use them for a musaf. So that's a question we still haven't resolved. Adkan.